I am a believer, and I'm convinced of a historic sexual ethic, and I'm gay. I'm same-sex attracted, and that's part of my story. So yeah, getting into that and how that all kind of started. I grew up hearing that gay people were gross and that they hated God, and most of the conversation about gay people was, contentious political debate about gay marriage. So it was just pretty clear that like gay people are dirty, gross, and disgusting, or at least that's what was communicated to me.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name is Derry. And guys, if you haven't already done it, check us out on social media. Especially, it'd be awesome if you would leave us a review on Spotify or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. It'd be amazing. We also have YouTube. We are on Instagram, pretty active on there. We have TikTok. Anywhere else you'd probably want to find us, we're most likely there. We don't have a LinkedIn, though, so don't go there. But everywhere else you probably find us. We love to interact. We love to hear your questions. And with that, let's get into it.
Yeah, so today's guest we're really excited to have on. He's an author, speaker, church consultant, monastery builder, and a licensed counselor. He's the founder and executive director of this ministry called Equip, and that's the premier consulting and training solutions for churches aspiring to be places where gay people can thrive according to historic sexual ethic, and they've trained over 20,000 church leaders.
Awesome.
He's been on shows like Theology and The Raw and with Preston Sprinkles, and a number of others. So, Pieter Valk, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Is there anything that we missed in that you would like to go over?
Yeah, or any books or other series or articles you've written that you want to plug at the beginning?
Well, I've had the privilege of writing for a variety of publications. And I'm sure we'll get to some links later for follow-up resources. But the easiest way for people to find some of the things I've written in other podcasts is to go to peterlvalk.com. But my first name's spelled funny, so I'm sure we'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah, it'll be in there.
Yeah.
Peter with an I at the beginning.
Yep.
So I got to ask you, monastery builder, what does that even look like? Because we come from a Protestant background, and I've always had this dream, or I thought that in order to be a monk, you had to not be married, and I just got married. So now I was always like, well, but when I wasn't married, I had this dream that I wish some part of me, some deep in my soul, wish I could retire to the mountains and just live a simple life and study the scriptures. But I'm too caught up in the modern society and cities and technology to actually do that.
Fair enough.
But it's always been very interesting to me, like the monastic life, or what I think the monastic life is. So what does that even look like, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so in the Middle Ages, a particular kind of cloistered, ascetic monasticism took over in the church and was the predominant form of people doing monasticism or who called themselves monks. But before that, and kind of in the early church and the apostles' disciples and their disciples and their disciples, the most common form of Christians doing celibacy was kind of a word called the Rimnuoth, or like city monks. And they lived in the city. They were a part of their local churches. They were a part of the economy of the city. They lived in kind of homes with other single people, but right next door to married people with their kids that go to their church, and they were abstinent and committed to lifetime abstinent singleness for the sake of the kingdom, and they believed they were supposed to be using their availability from not raising kids to do kingdom work that parents can't, and to serve their church and serve their community. So that early church form of celibacy, early church form of monasticism, I would argue a more biblical form of celibacy and monasticism. That's what we're trying to retrieve in the intentional Christian community that I live in, which is called the Nashville Family of Brothers. And it's a longer story of how that got started, but long story short, myself and some other guys knew we were called to lifetime singleness for the sake of the kingdom. We also knew that we had not been given some magical gift of celibacy where we didn't need human companionship anymore. And so we asked our pastors how are we going to find the family in the body of Christ that we need? And they were really honest that they didn't think that our local churches were going to be able to offer the kind of family we truly needed anytime soon. But that historically, monasticism has been the most common way that celibate people have found family. It's been the greatest source of theology in the church. It's been the greatest source of social justice in the church. It's been the greatest source of evangelism in the church. So it came highly recommended from them. And so we've been trying to kind of find a modern, urban way to do monasticism, where we're still a part of our local churches, still a part of a biological family, still a part of friends outside of our community, but also have a robust sense of family in our intentional Christian community. That most importantly, sends us back to the Lord and spurs us on in our sanctification.
Wow. Is this the only kind of group that exists like this, or are there different chapters of it?
So we are the only chapter of the Family of Brothers, although we're talking with some guys in other cities about starting families of brothers there and families of sisters in other cities. But when we first started doing this, we found a brotherhood up in Michigan who was doing something different in some ways, but similar in a lot of ways. And they've been able to provide us with a lot of advice, but also a lot of it has just been going back to the descriptions of the early church and how they did this and saying, maybe they had the secret sauce. What if we just cook it,
Yeah.
So that's what we've been doing.
What part of Michigan?
They're spread throughout some of the different major cities. So it's a brotherhood called Servants of the Word. And they are ecumenically Christian, as is our community. Although a majority of the guys in their communities are charismatic Catholic.
Whoa,
Interesting.
You don't meet many of those.
So,
Yeah.
it's a cool place.
Yeah, I'm not sure the order of the episodes coming out right now, but last week we interviewed one of our friends named Tate Medina, and he's on TikTok, really influential, and he's Catholic.
Yeah.
And so we had like a almost 2-hour conversation about the Pope, and then like afterwards I was like, wait, what do Catholics believe about the gifts of the Spirit? Because we're both charismatic. And so, and we are in ministry, we like run schools, and so we have a lot of these conversations about the gifts. And so I was like, wait, I've never heard a Catholic talk about that, but that's interesting that there's charismatic Catholics out there.
Yeah. Okay. I know really fast, this isn't what we're like necessarily talking about, but I'd love to know, because I know you talk about this a lot. Do you know what it's, well, I guess you know what it's like, but how does somebody know that they're called to singleness for their whole life? In your opinion, because you always have the classic, like a girl like breaks up with a guy, and then all of a sudden like you're in this place of like, am I called to singleness forever? You're just like hurting and stuff like that, and you start considering it. And so, in your opinion, what is it like to be
young
called
Christian without a girlfriend, and a young Christian guy without a girlfriend's like, I'm just in a season of singleness.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the reverse question is just as pertinent and reveals something about how we think about marriage and singleness. And by that I mean, how does someone know that they're called to make a lifetime commitment of Christian marriage to someone? That's my experience with Christian married people is it is just as hard as celibacy and ends in ruin just as often. It's just as desperately need the Lord to do it well. And just as often people get into it not being serious enough about it, and it ends up being the greatest source of pain in their life. So I think people should be as afraid of marriage as they are afraid of lifetime singleness.
Very interesting.
Very
and
hopeful.
They should approach both with caution, with fear, and saying, Lord, do you have a preference of which gift you want to give me? When we read Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7, both Jesus and Paul seem to suggest that there's a gift, there's a particular grace, there's a particular portion of support that God gives for kingdom singleness and for Christian marriage, and that God doesn't give both to all of us, and that God is the giver of that gift, and that God seems to have a preference of which gift he gives. And so, historically at least, Christians recognize that was an open-handed question for everyone, and that we'd probably be wisest if we asked the Lord, which gift do you want to give me, regardless of what my preference is? And then, God, would you conform my heart to your preference? And I'll step down that path. So I think it would be, I think something amazing would happen in the church if every Christian young adult recognized their preference, set it aside, and then open-handedly asked the Lord, which gift do you want to give me? And then pursued whichever gift that God wanted to give. Now, how does any Christian kind of discern like that? There's a variety of traditions of Christian discernment. I think Ignatian discernment in the Catholic tradition is kind of one of the most like filled out traditions of kind of Christian discernment, most kind of concrete and kind of studied and practiced. But there's lots of ways that Christians discern, that the Christians intentionally ask the Lord questions. So, however one does that in their tradition, apply that to the question of Christian marriage or vocational singleness.
Awesome. Well, I know we can talk about that for a long time. I'd love to.
Sorry. Yeah.
Maybe at a future time. But today, we originally wanted to have you on because we read one of your articles in Fathom Magazine on being a Christian but being in the closet, and what it was like for the process of coming out of that, as well as some other things that were in there. And so we wanted to have you on to talk about that specifically. So if I could just ask straight up, when you were younger, when you were still like in the closet, what was it like to be a Christian and to be in that space? I know your faith has probably evolved since then, but for where you were then, what was it like?
Yeah, and the backstory for those listening is I am a believer, and I'm convinced of a historic sexual ethic, and I'm gay. I'm same-sex attracted, and that's part of my story. So yeah, getting into that and how that all kind of started, I grew up hearing that gay people were gross and that they hated God, and most of the conversation about gay people was, contentious political debate about gay marriage. So it was just pretty clear that like gay people are dirty, gross, and disgusting, or at least that's what was communicated to me.
Yeah.
And in the few times it came up in church, it was just a simple statement: God is against homosexuality. So when I started noticing that I was attracted to other guys, when I was going through puberty, at first I just ignored it. And then I vowed that no one would know. And I proverbially went into the closet, which is a phrase that, people use to describe when sexual and gender minorities recognize that they are different in that way. They hide from others about that part of their story. They walk into a psychological closet and lock the door and lock themselves inside because they're afraid if people knew about their story that they would be hurt, that they would be rejected, and that was my fear. I was afraid that if people knew me, that they would no longer love me, that they would find me dirty, gross, and disgusting, that if I were fully known, I would not be fully loved.
Wow.
So it's best just to hide. So that's what I did. And not merely by like not telling people, but I was obsessed about covering my tracks. I was obsessed with making sure no one would pick up on even a hint that same-sex attraction was my story. I analyzed how I spoke, and if I sounded too feminine, I analyzed how I walked. I analyzed the gestures I made. I rehearsed mental scripts of how I would like join in with my straight guy friends to talk about and objectify female classmates.
Wow.
Because it didn't come naturally to me. I didn't find any of these women attractive, so I had to like listen to how other guys talked and objectified other women, and then like parrot those back to them. I forced myself to date girls, even though I wasn't really interested in any of them. I pre-puberty, I had like back-to-back lead roles in school plays in our middle school, and then when I got to high school. And I realized everyone who was in the theater club was also in the Gay Straight Alliance. I quit theater because I was terrified. If I was associated with those people would think I was gay. And I remember like super vehemently arguing against the legalization of gay marriage. When I was in high school, that was back in the States in 2000. 2007, 2008, when those things were being debated most, I was hoping no one would suspect that the super Jesus-y guy who played soccer and dated girls and spoke critically of gay people and gay marriage, he couldn't possibly be gay himself. So a lot of work, a lot of effort to try to hide from other people, and make sure that they didn't think this was a part of my story. And then in the meantime, while I was in the closet, when I was in there alone, I was busy trying to make myself straight. I prayed thousands of prayers that God would eliminate my same-sex attractions. I would do hundreds of hours of counseling with therapists who said they could reduce my same-sex attractions and increase my opposite-sex attractions. I interned for, after college, I interned for a Pray the Gay Away ministry for 9 months, hoping that might change something about my story.
Is that what it was called?
But,
or is that the type of ministry it was?
The type of ministry was kind of a Pray the Gay Away ministry.
Okay.
The ministry doesn't exist anymore. The ministry doesn't exist anymore for the right reasons. But nothing changed about my sexual orientation. But I did, from that decade in the closet of trying to make myself straight, I gained a lot of self-hate and a lot of shame and a lot of loneliness and a lot of anxiety. Mind you, I continued to be committed to a historic sexual ethic. I continued to follow Jesus and yearn to follow his teachings. I wasn't contemplating running off into the sunset with some guy, but I was worried that even if I just shared that I was same-sex attracted but not acting on it, that people would still love me less and treat me less and find me disgusting. Because I knew other people who that was their story and that's how people responded.
Yeah. So what was the thing that helped you continue to be a Christian through all that? Because I know a lot of people have experienced that and it gets so hard and the tension there and trying to balance it that ultimately they might run the risk of deconverting and deconstructing and just trying to figure it out on their own. What was the thing that anchored you to Christianity?
Yeah, so I don't want to oversimplify it too much, but I grew up with a mix of different ideas about God and Jesus, and plenty of hearing about Jesus's love for me and Jesus's compassion and God's love for the world. And that's why he sent his son and was willing to die on the cross for our sins. But I also heard plenty of, he is the God of the universe. And I, by default, deserve hell. And God doesn't owe me heaven. And so it's really important that I actually follow Jesus. And it's really important that even if I don't feel it, I choose to believe that a God exists, and that's the God of the Bible. And I choose to follow his wisdom, and I choose to take my salvation seriously because it has eternal consequences. This isn't, it doesn't matter if I think God is cringe. He's still the God of the universe. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. He doesn't care. Yeah, right. If I think he's cringe and I just decide to cancel him, then I might go to hell.
Yeah. Were there other things that you explored? We're not going to
pressure God into letting me into heaven. Yeah. So I just had a sense of it doesn't matter whether I think this is fair. If he's the God of the universe, he makes the rules.
Yeah. Did you explore other avenues of thought patterns and maybe religions or ways of life and then came back and was no, I'm convinced Christianity is true?
I'd say in college, is when I kind of got exposed to alternate interpretations of Scripture, and engaged with those. But I never found them just by nature. I'm kind of I'm a heavy T on the Myers-Briggs. I think a lot before I feel, or I recognize that Anyway, that's all to say that while there was a lot of emotional appeal to many of the arguments for revisionist sexual ethic, I knew that for me to kind of have respect for myself and for me to like adopt a revisionist sexual ethic and like hold on to it with integrity, I need to actually be convinced that it was more true. And I need to actually engage with the arguments in a robust and intellectually honest way.
Right.
And when I pushed myself to do that, they always fell apart. You know, to my dissatisfaction, right? Like I wanted a revisionist sexual ethic to be more satisfying, to be more true. And it just like fell apart in my hands every time I tried to examine it. No, I made plenty of mistakes. I failed to live up to my commitments of a historic sexual ethic plenty of times, you know, but I rarely doubted whether it was true. And even in the times when I sinned and I didn't live up to my commitment to a historic sexual ethic, that sin usually only further affirmed that, you know, that following a revisionist sexual ethic wasn't going to make me happier. You know, like often what would tempt me to sin was some version of the enemy whispering in my ear, you know, you're unhappy. It's because you don't have love with a man in a sexual and romantic way. If you just went and got that, you would be happy. So then I would go and get that, and it wouldn't make me any happier, you know? It'd make me happier for 4 hours, but it wouldn't make me happier for the next week. So yeah.
Yeah. What was it like emotionally being in that place of being in the closet and not wanting people to hate you for who you like, how you feel and who you are? What is that like emotionally for you to be in that space? I don't know how long you were in the closet for before you came out. Maybe you can answer that question as well.
Yeah, so I'd say I first recognized my same-sex attractions in 6th grade. I told another person for the first time in 11th grade. But I didn't start coming out to a wider group of people until sophomore year of college. So yeah. What was that like? You know, I think, and my background is graduate level training is in clinical mental health counseling, and I'm a licensed professional counselor. So it's not, you know, what's pretty typical is the way you survive it is you try to ignore it as much as possible. You try to shove it in a back corner and think about it as little as possible. But what that means is then you have to kind of disconnect from your feelings as well, so that you keep some distance from all of your feelings. So there's a general numbness to life, or a general kind of seeking of things that can help you numb your feelings. Accomplishments, video games, food, alcohol, drugs, you know, anonymous sex, all these things. People will sleep, you know, whatever it is. Schoolwork, you know, getting the good grades, getting to the best schools, you know, use these things to distract themselves from their own feelings and from the parts of my story that I wanted to avoid. So that's certainly what I did. You know, for me, my primary kind of drugs, so to speak, to avoid the pain of the closet was just to be obsessed with schoolwork and obsessed with accomplishments and obsessed with getting into the best school and getting the best scholarships and doing all those things. And then, like many people who are in the closet, you know, developed really unhealthy habits with pornography and masturbation. And to be clear, that's not because gay people are any more likely to be sex addicts than straight people inherently. But I think the closet is the perfect petri dish for sexual addiction, unfortunately. Because that's the one place you can. It's false intimacy, but some part of your mind thinks, well, at least there's this one place where I can connect with the kind of intimacy that I want.
Right.
And it's a kind of a pressure release valve, or at least it claims to be that. You know, some part of our brain tells us it will be a pressure release valve. This will help me get through another week, another month.
Right.
So.
Wow. Was there anybody along the way of that journey that you were talking about? You came out to a few people, you said, every once in a while. But was there anybody along that journey that might have made you think, like, oh, maybe like I would be accepted if I did, and you're like, no, I need to like reject this. Was there anybody along the way that made you feel like that, or no?
Yeah, so would say a tough experience was when I first told my parents. They didn't know how to help me any more than I knew how to help myself.
Yeah.
And so, that the only solution they thought of, and when they asked around some friends, was they took me to a therapist who, we spent the hour talking about strategies to kind of block out gay thoughts in my mind. And then I got in the car with one of my parents after that session, and the parent asked me, "So is it fixed?" And I said, "Yes."
Wow.
And then we never talked about it again for 5 years.
Whoa.
And similarly, like a year or two later, I, on one of these like youth group weekend retreats, after a like Saturday night devotional that was really emotional, and the person who gave the Devo was encouraging everyone to share with an adult leader about the things they felt the most shame about so they could have freedom from that burden. I then went and like talked to, the youth pastor about my story, and he was just like silent, and then like offered a couple of like Christian cliches, and then just basically sent me away.
Wow.
So I think, at least from those two experiences, my biggest takeaway wasn't that people would be like overtly harmful, but that they would be clueless, and that I would have to end up taking care of them.
Wow. Wow.
Because they wouldn't know how to handle it.
Yeah.
And so it's maybe just best for me to make sense of this by myself. I'm more of an expert than any of them are going to be anyway. I should make sense of this by myself.
Yeah.
But certainly other people's stories have been, overt, painful reactions to people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, like being years removed from that situation and the going through the counseling that didn't work, and that one ministry that is shut down now, I feel like growing up, it's kind of the same thing that like we experienced. Was like the idea, the narrative was like, yeah, pray the gay away or whatever. Or you're like, no one's born gay, but now science has come out and kind of said the opposite of that. How do Christians kind of like understand that in a theological matter of like, well, if it's true that people are born gay, then why God? Why are they like that? And one thing that like, and it's in the other thing, like you can't just like, you said they said, hey, is it fixed? And you said, yeah, like, but the thing about that is like, well, you can't help who you're attracted to. And like, I remember I heard a gay person say that, like, Ethan, start liking men or something like that. And I was like, oh, is that how it is for you? Like, yeah, that's impossible. Like, it's not something that you consciously are just deciding to do. It's just a natural thing that happens. And so how do Christians understand that in a theological matter? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So the classic kind of forced choice of born gay or choose to be gay. So I think the most scientifically accurate answer is neither. We neither choose who we're attracted to, nor are we born biologically or genetically determined to develop our sexual orientations. And I mean, actually, if you consult with kind of the most rigorous, LGBT plus scientists, progressive secular scientists, they would say, anyone who claims that people are born gay just haven't looked at the science.
Wow.
The science is pretty clear that there is some kind of genetic predisposition. So there's a meaningful genetic factor, but it's not the majority factor.
Interesting.
We don't know what the other factors are, but the only other factors could be something environmental, something nurture-based. And so the science seems to show that the majority contributor to developing our sexual orientations is environmental, is nurture, is what we grow up. So we are neither born gay nor do we choose to be gay. But people, I think people say, well, people don't choose their sexual orientations. And if when people ask God to change their sexual orientations, he doesn't, well, that must mean that God intends for them to be as they are, intends for them to have the sexual orientations that they do. And therefore it would only, a kind God must allow them to seek monogamous, loving relationships with the people that he gives them desires for. So I think the problem with that reasoning is none of us are how God made us to be. None of us are born how God intended us to be. All of us are, God imagined us, before time, like how we would be perfectly if we were born into a perfect world. And then we are when we're formed in our mother's womb, our genes are broken, our genetics are broken. Then we form imperfectly in a physical way around those genetic instructions. We form imperfectly in our mother's womb. And then we are born into a broken world that injures us countless times before we ever gain the agency to sin ourselves. And then we gain the agency to sin ourselves, and then we muck it up even more. None of us are how God made us to be. All of us are messed up. So how we are today doesn't tell us anything about God's intentions. And I think if we, at least for believers, if we study, particularly Romans 1, it talks about in Romans 1, not only does it talk about the morality of same-sex sexual behavior, but it talks about whether the desires for same-sex sexual behavior are good or whether those are God's intentions. And it makes pretty clear that they're not, that they're broken. And God doesn't intend broken things for us. Okay, so then it seems clear God does not intend for anyone to experience same-sex attraction, but we develop it because of brokenness in genetically and brokenness in the world around us. God allows that to happen, and then most of the time when we ask God to change that, he chooses not to. Well, what gives? Like, how is that okay, right? Is at least a reasonable question that a lot of people go to next. That's really the classic question of like, why do bad things happen to seemingly innocent people, right? I mean, that's a broader theological apologetics question of evil kind of thing, and different people from different traditions have different answers to that question. So, at least for me, what's comforting is a theology of a really robust theology of free will and particularly kind of free process. Yeah. The idea that in order for our choices to mean something, God chooses to allow the consequences of our decisions to play out. Even if the consequences of those decisions are injury on us and injury on others around us. Yeah. He chooses the greater good of allowing us to have a real choice, even if that means he has to, sometimes step away and allow things to fall apart. And so I think I developed this brokenness in my life because of the sin and the broken decisions of other people in multiple generations back and in the generation that I grew up in and was surrounded by. And God chose not to swoop in and protect me from the consequences of other people's decisions and keep me from developing same-sex attractions because of the greater good of allowing other people and myself to have real choice. So, we see plenty of examples in Scripture of people asking God to heal them and make everything better, and he doesn't, and all of us have friends who have something broken about them that they've asked God to make right, and he hasn't. So, gay people are not unique in that way. But I think, I'll say what comforts me around all of that is that, God says in his scriptures that he will work through all things for his glory and for my good. And I've seen that to be true. Like, despite this brokenness of same-sex attractions enduring in my life, God is kind of using that enduring brokenness to bring him glory and to bring goodness to my life. I mean, it's submitting my sexuality to God and following where he leads has been the greatest source of purpose and meaning and joy and belonging and community in my life. So it's definitely worth it, for me.
Wow. What a good philosophically rich answer. I know a lot of that, like you said, is a lot of the answer to the problem of evil that a lot of people take with just natural corruption, making sense of a lot of things, which, like, on top of the free will aspect of it, like you said. And we answer a lot of people's questions because we do a lot of apologetics and we do a lot of evangelism. And if people just understood that, so many questions would be answered. Like It's also kind of funny that people don't make this realization themselves too, because so many people will be like, "Oh, like this is just how I am. This is how God created me. I have this thing that it's just how I am, even if it's not positive." But then like they're like, "I have this toxic trait. Hee hee, I'm a Virgo. Like I can't get rid of it," or something like that. Or I'm trying to get rid of it, and like they pick and choose some things that are wrong with them that they're trying to change, and some things that are wrong with them that are just like how God made you. And I just get so confused how people like choose. This is the thing that I'm gonna say God made me this way, but like this is the thing that I'm gonna try to change. It's interesting. So people understand that natural corruption aspect of it. It solves so many issues for the Christian.
Yeah, and I like that point a lot too, because when in evangelism, when I've talked to people, and specifically this one time I was in California, and this high schooler said, "Hey," and they asked like, "Hey, does God hate gay people?" And I was like, "No." And I'm like, so sorry that like society hasn't done a good job of showing you that. And the truth of the matter is like, look, if you're gay, you have an attraction to another individual, and if it doesn't follow the biblical guidelines for what is okay, then you don't act on it. Just like I am a straight guy, but like I don't get to sleep with girls I'm not married to because it doesn't follow the biblical mandate. And I was like, look, we both are dealing with a type of lust or attraction, and we both have to respond accordingly. So there's actually not that much difference other than who we're attracted to. And I do want to recognize that like for gay people, it's a lot harder because they don't ever get to satisfy that longing, you know, like at least a straight person could get married to the opposite gender. But the thing about it where like I notice a lot is that people will say like, oh, because I'm gay, like I have to act this out, and I'm going to act this out, and I'm going to maybe do some hermeneutical gymnastics to make the Bible say it's okay. But I also notice that people, like you were saying, oh, I'm just a Virgo. Christians do this all the time for normal things too. Yeah. Like even non-sexual things. It's like, well, I'm just like, people be like punching holes in walls, and they're like, well, I'm just angry. I'm just an angry person. And I'm like, well,
that's how God made
the
me.
Bible says to put away all anger and malice. So you have to put that away. You don't get to stay there just because you have a bad temper. It just tells, I'm like, you just don't read that part of the Bible, I guess. And it's not like, there's things that I probably have where I'm like that too, you know? And it's just funny where we do that like with Enneagram stuff, right? People would take the Enneagram and then be like, hey, how come you didn't talk to that person who hurt you? And they're like, well, I'm just a 9, so I'm not confrontational.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that doesn't matter.
Right.
So funny.
Yeah.
Wow. So moving on from this point, what was it like for you to come out of that closet, to finally come to a point where you would come out to people? And you can maybe let us know like how that happened, and if it was one person or just like post it on social media. I don't know.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's everybody or one person. So can you share with us that story? What was that like, getting from a place where you are totally afraid to let people know like who you were to being okay with it?
Yeah, it was a mixed bag. So, for example, I, shared a lot with the campus ministry that I was a part of in undergrad, and, led Bible studies and discipled people and led recruitment efforts and represented our organization to the university, and was given, every reason to believe that if I wanted to go on staff with this campus ministry after I graduated, that I could. And then, by the end of my senior year, I was told out of the blue, and not very little explanation, that not to apply to go on staff at that campus or with that ministry at any campus.
Wow. And
the only explanation they gave was that they didn't know what to do with me and my same-sex attractions. So some of the reactions that I got, were really cruddy.
Wow.
But, thankfully, I think there were stops and starts of kind of sharing my story with different kind of groups and of people, smaller groups of people. But I would say the moment when it felt like, I don't know, I would say, what moment did I come out? What moment did I share with a critical mass of people that it felt like something changed about whether or not I was in the closet or not? Was probably sophomore year of college, when I was in a Christian fraternity, and there was a guy in our Christian fraternity who left our Christian fraternity because he was in an unrepentant sexual relationship with another guy. But that caused a lot of controversy because we were on a secular private university, and a lot of brothers kind of responded to that episode poorly. And so I just felt compelled that I needed to share my testimony with, all 100 guys in our fraternity, Christian fraternity, so that guys who were straight would know how to kind of talk more compassionately and love people like me better. And if there were any other guys in the fraternity who had the same story and convictions as me, that they would know they weren't alone. So, with much terror, I shared with this group of 100 guys. And to my delight, they responded so positively. I mean, like one after another, so many guys lined up to give me a hug and pulled out their phone and, said, I want to get coffee. I want to hear more about your story. Like, thank you so much for your courage. And then in like the 6 to 8 months after that, about 10 to 15 guys in the fraternity, one at a time, shared with me privately that they had the same story and convictions that I did. And often I was one of the first people that they had told.
Wow.
So I think both because of the overwhelmingly loving and positive response of the straight guys in that fraternity, and then because it was kind of a sharing my story in that space, opened the door to connect with others with a similar story and convictions. And then we were able to do life together and support each other in mostly healthy ways. Yeah, that was a really key moment for me, a really beautiful moment for me.
Wow.
In many ways, that was the beginning of all of the work I do today.
Yeah.
Because doing life with those, other 10 guys, we all realized kind of two things we had in common. We were all afraid that if we followed the Bible's teachings, we would be alone for a lifetime. And none of us had parents or pastors who knew what to do with us, who knew how to help us. So that was, in many ways, that was the beginnings of, in 2014, I started Equip to equip parents and pastors with the understanding and skills to better love and serve people like me. And then in 2018, I helped start the Nashville Family of Brothers to offer family to men called to vocational singleness, regardless of sexual orientation.
Well, I know if we ever are part of running a church, we'll definitely hire you to help us. So
It'd be fun.
But I have this question. I have a lot of friends who probably share a similar experience as you. But this is the difference that I see in some of them. And I'd love your thoughts on this. A lot of them will say, well, I am attracted to the same gender as myself, but I'm not going to identify as gay because I don't want that to be part of my identity, right? And whether or not they're trying to not be gay anymore, or they're still accepted it, whatever it is, they don't want to use that label. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think people should use kind of whatever language is most helpful for them, and whatever is most conducive for their sanctification. So at least for me, the phrase same-sex attraction is pretty strongly associated. I mean, it was popularized by the Pray the Gay Away movement, and for me, it's pretty strongly associated with my decade in the closet, going to Pray the Gay Away therapist, working at a Pray the Gay Away ministry, having some really painful, psychologically destructive experiences. So that phrase has a lot of baggage for me. Whereas I'm a part of a community of Christians who are Christians and convinced of a traditional sexual ethic and use the word gay to describe themselves, just using the word gay to mean boys who like boys or girls who like girls. Nothing more. And that's how most people in our world today use the word gay. It doesn't. They have an assumption that every human will seek out romantic relationships with people they're drawn to. But that's also baked into the word straight. And I mean, actually, if you look at people also expect Christian marriages to divorce at the same rate as non-Christian marriages, right? So, I mean, if people's associations with words should keep them from using it, then we should not call our Christian marriages because they actually tell a lie about what they're supposed to be. So anyway, so it's just a longer conversation about words and what they mean. So for me, when I use the word gay, I use it because it doesn't have the baggage that same-sex attraction does. I use it because my primary audience is often, gay non-Christian teenagers and gay non-Christian young adults. And for them, just using the language that they use means that there's one less barrier to evangelism. If I started exclusively using the phrase same-sex attraction and kind of policing that in early conversation with non-believers who are gay, that's going to create even more problems to them getting to know Jesus. And yeah, I'm using that word, I'm not using that word ontologically. Like, I'm not using that word to say who I am fundamentally or in an essential way. I'm not using that word to say how God intended me. Yeah. I'm just using it in a phenomenological way. This is the word people use to describe people who have the experience I do. So yeah. Awesome. But I totally respect people who prefer different language.
Yeah. Earlier, you had mentioned how when you were younger, you battled a lot of self-hate and shame. And so what was the journey, or was there a moment in which you encountered God in a radical way, or it's just years of hard discipleship that led you to overcoming that? What was the journey to overcome that? Coming out, going from in the closet to out of the closet, all the shame and self-hate that you were feeling, to now being open about it and free in Jesus. What was that like?
Right. Yeah, so a lot of it was meeting with some good therapists who weren't trying to make me straight, but were trying to help me make sense of that self-hate and unpack that. There was a lot of bad theology baked into that. It was helpful for me to kind of really clean up how I conceptualized all of this and recognize that this wasn't God's intention for me, but also God is not surprised and God does not blame me for this part of my story, and that God's choice not to heal this is not because he doesn't love me and is not because I'm not trying hard enough, but it's just because that's the way it is for most people. And it was important for me to kind of unpack, there's been sexual sin in my life, but my sexual sin isn't any worse than the analogous straight sexual sin outside of marriage. It's still bad, but there was an extra layer of oh my gosh, gay sex outside of marriage is so much worse than straight sex outside of marriage. And I had to kind of interrogate that. Well, why do I think that is? And I realized, that's just a bunch of homophobia loaded up inside of me. They both equally fall short of God's plan. So it was helpful to clean out some of that. I think the more I shared my story with other believers and they responded with love, the more I started to believe, other people, maybe they actually love me and won't treat me less because this is a part of my story. And then it was easier to see my own self that way. And I'd say, and again, this is maybe one of the reasons why I use the word gay, seeing gay people in music and in TV and in movies and in different places presented as normal humans, and also I think helped me recognize that, helped me see myself as normal and lovable. Awesome. So there's certainly broken parts about gay culture and broken parts about gay representation in media. But yeah, I think all of those things together really helped. So,
wow. And then what has been the experience of finding fulfillment in Christ and relationship with your brotherhood that you have? Because I think we'd all agree that, and maybe I think you would, but based on a conversation, that God created us for human interaction and human friendship and relationship, right? And so that is a deep part of how we feel totally loved and fulfilled. But also Christ can fill a large portion of that. Say someone gets saved in solitary confinement and they never see humans for a long time. I'm sure they can live a noticeably good, fulfilled life in Christ alone through a lot of prayer, right? But coming from where you were coming from and finding fulfillment in Christ alone, can you comment on that? And how do people who maybe they're just straight but are not married and they just are wanting to get married one day, but they're always like, but maybe it's been like years and years and years, and they're kind of like, God, how do I find fulfillment in this? Or like in the singleness, how do I find fulfillment? And then also coming from the background of a gay Christian, how do you find fulfillment in just Christ alone, or the friends and family that you've found?
Yeah, for sure. So my story is maybe unique in some ways, maybe not unique in other ways, but I've actually experienced a pretty profound kind of spiritual drought or darkness or distance over the past 9-10 years. So I pretty intermittently for the past 10 years have experienced God in kind of a feeling way or an undeniable way. And I went through, particularly in the early years of experiencing that, I was very tortured by that. And believed that it was because I wasn't trying hard enough to connect with God, and followed lots of different people's suggestions of different ways that I could work harder to force God to connect with me in a way that I feel. I was grateful that after a couple years of that, I connected with a pastor who then connected me with some different texts from kind of pastors and Christian leaders throughout the ages who have experienced kind of this darkness for a prolonged period of time, and kind of normalize that actually maybe for a lot of Christians, they experience an extended period of kind of feeling disconnected from God for a lot of their life, right? Like Mother Teresa, shares in her diaries, for a majority of her super fruitful ministry, like clearly the Lord present with her in some way and guiding her, felt a profound emptiness, a profound absence of the Lord. And yet she continued to be faithful. And books like A Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross and Interior Castle by St. Teresa of Avila. And I'm not Catholic, I'm Anglican, but I find a lot of these resources helpful. Yeah. Just kind of comforted me that sometimes often what God does when along someone's path of spiritual maturity, it's kind of when we're ready to wean off of spiritual milk and move towards something else. One of the things that's true of being a baby Christian is it's easy for us to become more infatuated with his gifts than with the giver. And one of the very common ways it seems throughout the ages that God then has discipled his people is to then remove the gifts in a way that leads to desert and emptiness and distance. And slowly, or perhaps over a lifetime, the person relearns to love the giver absent the gifts. And not because they're doing anything wrong, but that's just God's plan for how he's going to disciple them. So anyway, that's unfortunately been my story. It's certainly not my preference, but I've kind of settled into that's my reality. And I choose to believe that God exists, and I choose to live as if a person who felt God fully. And my hunch is maybe God finds something delightful about a faith that truly this is a wager for me. Truly I have no reassurance that this is real, but nonetheless I'm all in. So in light of that, one of the things that my pastor then said was that maybe God won't maybe you won't feel God in a direct way. But one of the reasons why God gave us human family, why God gave us Christian marriage, and why God gave us, vocational single people living in intentional Christian community, God gave us these different forms of Christian human family, is for us to experience the love of God through other believers. And particularly with people that we kind of live in kind of a permanent, daily kind of embodied way. Is where it's easiest for us to receive God's love through kind of healthy relationship with other believers. And so that was a part of his encouragement for us to start the Nashville Family of Brothers is, Peter, you need a robust experience of human family because that might be the only way that you experience God's love. And as a married person, he said, and like my marriage is one of the primary ways that I experience God's love, and that's good, you know. So yeah, that has been a lot of kind of why, you know, we started the Nashville Family of Brothers. And you know, it's I think just like a marriage, you know, well, not just like a marriage, similar to a marriage in some ways. You're really able to love someone in the healthiest ways, and receive someone else's love in the healthiest ways, when you believe that they're actually committed, and when you believe that they won't leave, when you can trust them. And so that's been a lot of what we've been slowly building in the Nashville Family of Brothers is building kind of shared time with each other, and guys kind of increasingly making longer commitments to our community, building up to making lifetime commitments to our community, so that our hearts can really trust that, oh, we can trust, like, that we can receive God's love consistently in this space. So yeah, that's been a big part of my story. And honestly, you know, I don't, speaking to the kind of the other part of your question a little bit more, a bit more briefly, you know, to the person who's single, but maybe doesn't prefer to be single for a lifetime, but is wondering kind of, how do I find family in the body of Christ in the short term? You know, I think it's important to think about, there's actually 3 major relational categories in Scripture. There's the singleness we're all born into. Okay. They're stepping out of that singleness into Christian marriage. And they're stepping out of that singleness we're all born into the kind of committed, intentional singleness for the sake of the kingdom that Jesus talks about in Matthew 19 and Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7. Those are distinct, you know. And the early church understood that kind of singleness that Jesus and Paul was talking about was a permanent giving up of the prospect of Christian marriage. And that was the unanimous understanding of, like, 3 decades of church fathers and mothers. So, like, pretty clear that's probably Jesus and Paul's intentions. So I don't know if it's really healthy for Christians to continue in that uncommitted, you know, temporary singleness that we're born into for long into their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. You know, I guess my prayer for every Christian is that they would get busy settling down into Christian marriage or settling down into vocational singleness. And I don't really have a solution for how to find robust family and uncommitted singleness. But the early church has a pretty robust solution for, if you commit to vocational singleness, how you can find family in the body of Christ. And it's something similar, I think, to what we're doing in the Nashville Family Brothers. People can certainly, you know, organize less formal, less, you know, intense, intentional Christian community. But I think that's, to any single person out there who thinks they might be single long-term and they're saying, you know, I need more than just a revolving door of roommates and small groups. I need something permanent. I just want to affirm, like, I think the Lord put that desire in your heart for something permanent. He made all of us for permanent family. So yeah, hang on to that and explore that with leaders in your community. How might you be able to form, build, cultivate something where you could actually get permanent lived-in family?
Wow, that's really powerful. And speaking to the first thing that you said about the separation from God or not feeling His presence, I was listening to a philosopher yesterday, and he was talking about how only on this earth could we experience the kind of faith building or soul building that could happen with the absence of feeling God's presence when you know that He's real. Because in heaven, you could never grow that kind of faith because you're in the presence of the Lord. So it's really interesting. Something of value that you could take from that. Going on to one of our last questions. This is a pretty contentious topic, but we'd love to ask it and know your opinion. Many Christians, when discussing this topic, have very different opinions on should someone, if they're coming out as gay, try to continue in that, like, with that terminology, or should they try to stop being gay, like you kind of talked about at the beginning? Should we try these therapies? Should we try to convert to be straight? And kind of Ethan touched on that a little bit. Should Christians try to do that at all if you're same-sex attracted, or should we just accept how we are, born or evolve?
Right, right. Yeah, so we've already chatted a bit about, it's not God's intention for people to develop same-sex attractions. It's a brokenness. It's a result of the fall. I also want to recognize God absolutely can do miracles. And God does miracles still. And so sometimes people ask for God to change their sexual orientation, and he does, and I believe people when they tell me, when they share that kind of testimony with me. I also know that, scientific studies show that 96% of the time when someone seeks out sexual orientation change efforts, they don't experience any change in their sexual orientation. And those stats, anecdotally match the hundreds of gay people that I know, Christian and non-Christian, who have sought in various forms sexual orientation change efforts. So, but that 3 to 4% of the time, sexual orientation change does happen. And that seems like the frequency of a miracle. So yeah, I accept that, I think the challenge is those same studies found that for gay people who seek out sexual orientation change efforts, their risk of suicide attempts increases by 92%.
Wow.
So the likelihood that they will, if they attempt sexual orientation change efforts, the likelihood that they will attempt suicide nearly doubles. So, doubling suicide attempts, 96% ineffective at changing your sexual orientation. For me as a therapist, or as a godparent, if I'm imagining my godson being in that position, or my friends I care about deeply, that's not a good deal.
Right.
That doesn't sound worth it.
Aren't good odds.
To try, to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't I'm certainly not judging anyone for asking the Lord to change as part of their story, or exploring some ways that they hope that they might reduce their same-sex attractions or increase their opposite-sex attractions. I completely understand the yearning to find relief from that brokenness, and for that not to be a part of what we have to deal with. But it does seem like it's spiritually and psychologically dangerous. So instead of that, at least for me, I kind of moved on from asking God to change my sexual orientation. Instead, I started focusing on God. How are you going to use my enduring brokenness for your glory and for my good? And I've already shared that, how I've seen that to be true. Yeah, it's going to be difficult. But often when I meet with counseling clients who want me to help them change their sexual orientation, I first am clear with them. I don't know how to change people's sexual orientation. There are no interventions that are proven to be effective. But can we talk about, why you want that? And if you want to pray, or if they ask me to pray for them, either in session or outside of session, hey, will you pray for me as well that God would change my sexual orientation? I say, well, tell me why you really hope that's what God would do. And I said, and more importantly, can you share with me, if God chooses not to change your sexual orientation, what then? How would you deal with that? And for a lot of them, they reveal that basically, well, if God's not willing to change my sexual orientation, then I'm not willing to follow his wisdom.
Wow.
And then that opens up a really a lot of opportunity, a lot of really fruitful conversation with them about, well, is that, it sounds like you're kind of giving God an ultimatum, is that wise for a believer to do? What's the risk of that? So, and then we get all into that conversation, and we talk, and for many of them, it's they've got some of the same broken ideas, mixed up ideas that I did, that thinking that, well, if I'm this way, that must mean that God meant for me to be this way. They don't have, well, it would be cruel for God to not mean for me to be this way, but not change it. So, all those kind of things that we've already discussed, we go in and unpack all of that. So long story short, I don't judge anyone who prays that God would change their sexual orientation or is seeking out kind of help with that. but I have found it to be harmfully ineffective, and I often find it interesting to question, hey, what's your motivations for that? What happens if God doesn't? Are we prepared for that possibility? Because what's most important to me is you continue following Jesus and believing that he loves you and has good things for you.
Awesome.
That's really good.
Yeah, great answer. So as we come to the end of our show, we like to ask everybody the same question, because our show is founded on the idea that people have hard questions for Christianity that aren't answered well a lot of the time. We like to ask everybody that comes on our show, what is the main thing in your life that you've experienced? It could be an argument, it could be an experience that has made you question your faith. We want to ask these questions so that we can tackle the scary areas, the scary questions that people come up with in their own minds, and address them and sort of demystify them.
Yeah, and then how did you overcome it as well?
Yeah, how did you overcome it? And if you still struggle with it, that's totally fine too. So for you, what was that experience or question that really made you doubt that Christ is who he said he is, that God exists, anything like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest thing has been this, this kind of 10-year distance silence that I felt, and I can imagine, like, if a lot of your audience is a little bit more charismatic, they might be alarmed and really sad on my behalf to hear about, the distance I've experienced from God. But yeah, I mean, I think it brought up it led to multiple crises of faith, multiple times when does God even exist? And what do I do with that? And how do I continue in faith with doubt? I also don't want to undersell that there may be many people who are experiencing kind of a short-term felt distance from God, and maybe switching up their spiritual disciplines a bit will lead to feeling more connected with God. So I don't want to suggest that, I've just not been feeling God for a month, so I'll just give up,
Yeah.
But for those who do find, despite efforts, that this seems to persist, I think the question of, why would someone choose to continue to believe God exists if they consistently don't feel him? And is that a good wager? Is that a good risk? At least for me, the way I kind of convince myself is like a version of Pascal's wager, which is, if there is no God, well, then this is all meaningless. Like, this is kind of 80 years of chaos in a blip of meaningless eternity. And really, no matter how I spend my life, it's a waste because it has no meaning. Or if there's a God, and that God is the God of the Bible, then I'm convinced that the way I'm living out my life is the most worth it,
Yeah.
So, I'm going to do that.
Right.
And hope that God exists.
That's awesome.
So that might not be convincing for everyone, but that's kind of how I make sense of it in my head.
Yeah, and that's kind of all you can do. Like, if you don't have an experience of a God that you can kind of fall back on, every Christian should be convinced philosophically, in my opinion, that the model of theism is the most logical model, and then convinced through Christ's life, just simple Christianity, that we should be Christians based off that theistic model. I think it's a very good argument.
Yeah, and something that I always come back to when I'm in those seasons where it feels like it's like maybe spiritually quiet or dry is I've like found myself like, well, what am I upset about? Well, I'm upset about that I don't have an emotional closeness or feeling. But I thought, like, what if I never get that though? Like, is it worth it to follow Jesus I'm not guaranteed it? So I'm like, what if I never again feel like I used to when I was younger? And do I have enough reasons to still follow Jesus? And that's when you get into like philosophical, historical arguments. And then if you can like acknowledge, wow, okay, philosophically, if a God exists, it probably going to look like this. And then if there's one God, look at all the religions with one God, and then figure out where you want to put your camp. And I think Christianity is the most valid, obviously why I'm still a Christian.
Yeah.
And then I also think to myself, like, well, yeah, like, why do I think I'm entitled to a emotional presence of God? And one, I always ask, like, is that like the normal state of Christianity throughout history? Like, there's like millions of Christians for the last 2,000 years, and how many of those millions and millions of Christians have similar stories where they're like, yeah, I haven't felt him in 20, 30, 40 years, but I trust that he exists, and I trust that he's going to care for my soul.
Happens often.
And I think it shows a beautiful picture of like genuine discipleship, where it's like, hey, like I don't always see this, but I'm going to keep following because I trust that it's true, and I trust God, and if nothing else, when I die, I'll enter His presence, and it'll be okay. Yeah. And so I think I commend people who have that mentality, because it's like, wow, like you're really in it for a long haul. You've really like counted the cost and really stuck to it, and you're continue to stick to it, and that's very worthy of celebration.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. Well, with that, guys, thanks for coming back and listening to another week of the podcast. Peter, thank you for coming on. It's been a really exciting talk. I really am. I've been wanting to have this type of talk for a long time with someone who's like had the same experience as you, has still a Christian, and now has the whole ministry and a lot of authority on the subject. And so it's been an honor having you on. So thank you so much. And is there anywhere you want to plug for our audience so they can find you?
Yeah, the best way to check out some more resources and kind of articles and videos that explore a lot of the questions we did today is my website, PieterLValk.com. And then you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook with that same handle, Pieter L. Valk, Pieter L. Valk. So yeah, I would love to continue conversation with anybody, and you can reach out to me over socials or over email through the website if anyone has any questions. But yeah, thank you guys so much for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
And you guys know where to find us.
Yeah.
So we're not going to say that again. All right. See you next week.